On the night of November 24th, 1971, a man in a dark business suit did the impossible. He hijacked a Boeing 727. He demanded $200,000 in cash. And then at 10,000 feet, in the middle of a freezing storm, he jumped. He was never seen again. The story begins just a few hours earlier, on a cold Thanksgiving Eve at Portland International Airport. A man described as being in his mid-40s and nondescript walks to the Northwest Orient Airlines counter. He pays in cash for a one-way ticket on Flight 305 to Seattle. The name on the ticket? Dan Cooper. He boards the plane. Witnesses, passengers, and crew would later describe him as polite, quiet, and unremarkable. He sits in seat 18C, lights a cigarette, and calmly orders a bourbon and soda. Shortly after takeoff at 3 p.m., Cooper catches the attention of a flight attendant, Florence Schaffner. He hands her a folded piece of paper. In the 1970s, this was common. Florence assumed it was a lonely businessman passing her his phone number. She smiles and, without looking, slips it into her pocket. He leans in. "Miss," he says calmly, "you'd better look at that note. I have a bomb." Florence opens the note. Her smile vanishes. She does as he says. Cooper then opens his briefcase, just enough for her to see what's inside. She would later report seeing 8 red cylinders, a battery, and a tangle of wires. It looked, she said, all too real. Cooper closes the case and states his demand: $200,000 in $20 bills, 4 parachutes, 2 men and 2 reserve, and no funny business. He wants it all delivered when the plane lands in Seattle.
The package must be delivered by midnight. Don't deviate from the plan. Listen very carefully. If you deviate from the plan even slightly, I won't be responsible for the consequences. You understand the stakes, don't you? One wrong move and we're both finished.
At 5:39 p.m., Northwest Orient Flight 305 touched down at Seattle-Tacoma Airport. Cooper had the cabin lights dimmed and every window shade pulled down. He knew the tarmac would be swarming with FBI and police. On the ground, Northwest Orient's operations manager, Ali, made the exchange. He walked to the plane and handed over a knapsack containing $200,000 in unmarked $20 bills, 10,000 notes in total, weighing over 21 pounds. He also delivered the 4 parachutes Cooper had demanded. True to his word, Cooper released all 36 passengers, along with flight attendant Florence Schaffner. But he was far from finished. He kept the core flight crew hostage: Captain William Scott, co-pilot Bill Rackstraw, and 1 flight attendant, Tina McCoy, who would be his only liaison. His new destination? Mexico City. The plane needed to refuel. As a fuel truck pumped thousands of gallons into the wings, Cooper laid out his flight plan. And it was this plan that proved he was no ordinary criminal. He knew the aircraft intimately. He ordered the pilots to fly to Mexico City, but with a bizarre and dangerous set of instructions. The plane was to fly unpressurized at a low altitude of 10,000 feet. The speed was to be kept slow, just above styling at 100 knots, and most critically, he ordered the landing gear to remain down and the wing flaps to be lowered to 15 degrees. The pilots protested. The 727 was not designed to fly for thousands of miles like a broken down truck. It would burn fuel at an unsustainable rate. But Cooper was insistent. He knew exactly what this configuration would do. It would keep the plane slow and low, making a jump possible. He had one final command: the rear air stair. The 727's unique ventral staircase was to be unlocked. At 7:40 p.m., Flight 305 was back in the air. Cooper, now alone with Tina McCoy, calmly instructed her to go into the cockpit and lock the door. McCoy was now sealed in with the pilots, leaving Cooper completely alone. Over the intercom, one last time, she asked if there was anything else she could get for him. His voice came back, calm and final. No. At 8 p.m., somewhere over the vast black wilderness of southwestern Washington, a warning light flashed in the cockpit. The rear air stair was open. The pilots called over the intercom. There was no answer. At 8:13 p.m., the crew felt a sudden jolt, a change in air pressure. Cooper was gone. When the plane landed in Reno, FBI agents stormed the cabin.
Clear left side.
Clear right.
Moving forward. Aft cabin secure.
The man had vanished, but he had left clues behind.
Anything on your end?
Negative. Cushions clear? Clear.
Copy. Let's move forward.
On his seat, they found 8 Riley cigarette butts. They found 2 of the 4 parachutes. And in the single most important piece of evidence, he left his black clip-on J.C. Penney tie. The FBI now had the largest manhunt in American history on its hands. They had a description. They had a handful of strange clues. And they had a new name, born from a media mistake: D.B. Cooper. The search for the phantom hijacker had begun. The moment the plane was reported hijacked, the FBI launched one of the most extensive and expensive manhunts in its history. The operation was codenamed NORJAK for the Northwest Hijacking. They had to find a man who had jumped into 170 mph wind in the dead of night in freezing rain over one of the most rugged wilderness in North America. Hundreds of soldiers from Fort Lewis, along with FBI agents and local sheriffs, scoured the dense forest of southwestern Washington. Helicopters and fixed-wing aircraft crisscrossed the sky. But the search was a statistical nightmare. They found nothing. Cooper's jump was so effective, it literally changed aviation history. Boeing was forced to invent a device, the Cooper vane, a small wedge that prevents the rear air stair from being opened in flight ever again. They couldn't find a body. They couldn't find the money. So the FBI shifted its focus from finding where he was to finding who he was. Over the next decade, the FBI investigated and cleared over 800 suspects. But a few names always rose to the top. The first was Richard Floyd McCoy Jr. The similarities were stunning. Just 5 months after Cooper's jumps, McCoy, a Vietnam veteran and Green Beret, hijacked a United 727. He demanded $500,000 and 4 parachutes. And just like Cooper, he jumped from the rear air stair. McCoy was an experienced paratrooper, a demolition expert, and even a Sunday school teacher. He was caught just 2 days later. The case seemed closed, But when the two flight attendants who had spent the most time with Cooper, Florence Schaffner and Tina McCullough, were shown McCoy's photo, their answer was definitive. He is not the man. McCoy also had a verifiable alibi. He was at home for Thanksgiving, the day before the hijacking. The FBI officially ruled him out. Was McCoy a copycat who got caught? Or the real Cooper with a lucky alibi? The next suspect is the one many investigators still believe is their man, Robert Rackstraw, a man with a shadowy, volatile past. Rackstraw was a former army paratrooper, trained in explosives, and a skilled pilot. He had been kicked out of the military for faking his college credentials. An independent team of investigators led by author Thomas Colbert spent years building a case against him. They believed Rackstraw's unit in Vietnam had conducted Black Ops parachute permissions. Most compellingly, they pointed to a letter Rackstraw allegedly wrote. A letter that they claim contains a coded confession. When one investigator told Rackstraw he couldn't weasel out of this one, Rackstraw reportedly replied, "I can't weasel out of anything. I am not D.B. Cooper." The team believed that was the code. I am D.B. Cooper. But just like McCoy, the FBI had looked at Rackstraw not once, but several times and cleared him. No hard evidence ever tied him to the plan. But perhaps the most chilling suspect isn't a paratrooper. It's a man named Duane Weber. His story comes from his wife, Jo. In 1995, after 17 years of marriage, Duane was dying of kidney disease. In his final days, he was in and out of consciousness. But in a moment of clarity, he turned to his wife. "I have a secret to tell you," he said. "I am Dan Cooper." Jo, who had never even heard the name, dismissed it as the rambling of a sick man. He died just days later, but the name stuck in her head. Months later, she went to her local library and began to research. She was horrified. The man in the sketch was the man she married. She remembered a bad knee he claimed was from jumping out of a plane. She remembered a trip they took to the Columbia River, just miles from where the money would be found. She remembered him confessing to having an old ID with a fake name, a name he had thrown off a boat in San Francisco. But just like all others, there was no hard physical proof, no DNA match. The FBI remained unconvinced. The search had produced hundreds of names, thousands of theories, but not a single concrete answer. The case went cold, and for 9 years there was nothing, until a young boy digging in the sand stumbled on the one piece of the puzzle that was ever found. For 9 years, the case was frozen solid. The FBI had no new leads, and the public had only theories.
He had to be CIA, I'm telling you.
CIA? No way. He was just a common criminal, probably dead in the woods.
That's exactly what they want you to believe. Look, I'm telling you, he just vanished into thin air.
Nobody just vanishes with that much money.
Hey, maybe he's hiding out in Queens.
The trail of D.B. Cooper had vanished into thin air until February 10th, 1980. An 8-year-old boy named Brian Ingram was on a family picnic digging a fire pit on a remote sandy beach along the Columbia River known as Tenaba. His hands raking through the sand hit 3 decayed bundles of cash. The bundles were still held together by rotting rubber hands. His family, thinking they had found counterfeit money, turned them over to the FBI. agents in the FBI's lab began the painstaking process of drawing the bills and checking the serial numbers against the Cooper ransom list. The result was astonishing. They were a perfect match. It was the first and only piece of physical evidence from the hijacking ever found in the outside world. But this smoking gun didn't solve the mystery. It made it impossibly more complex. The discovery raised more questions than it answered. First, the location. Tana Bar was miles downstream and significantly west of the plane's flight path. How did the money get there? Engineers determined the money had been deposited after a 1974 dredging operation on the river, meaning it couldn't have been there since the night of the jump. And then there was the money itself. The 3 packets were found stacked together in the order they were given to Cooper. This suggested they hadn't been scattered by a 170-mile-per-hour free fall, but had been lost or placed there as a bundle. One theory: Cooper survived. He landed near the river, buried some of the money to retrieve later, and simply never came back for it. Another darker theory: the money was never buried at all. Cooper was killed in the jump. His body and 21-pound bag of cash landed in the Columbia River. For 9 years, the evidence lay at the bottom until a dredge sucked it up and spat it out onto Tana Bar, only to be found by a boy a year later. The $5,800 found on that beach is all that has ever surfaced. The other 9,710 bills, like the man who took them, are still missing. In the decades that followed, the case grew cold, but the legend only grew hotter. The black clip-on tie he left behind was analyzed for DNA in 2001, but the results were inconclusive.
The sequencer isn't detecting any viable samples.
It's completely clean. We have no DNA to analyze.
Finally, in 2016, after 45 years of dead ends, the FBI made a quiet announcement. The D.B. Cooper investigation was, in their words, no longer being actively investigated. The manhunt was over. The man had officially become a myth. D.B. Cooper is now less of a person and more of an American folk hero, the polite, phantom bandit who pulled off the perfect crime and simply disappeared. We are left with only the questions. Did he die in the wilderness? His bones and the remaining $194,000 lost forever to the forest of the Pacific Northwest? Or did he survive? Did he walk out of that forest, melt back into society, and live out his days in quiet anonymity, taking his secret with him to the grave? The case may be closed, but the mystery remains. The disappearance of D.B. Cooper is the definitive story of a man who, more than any other, time has tried to forget. Who do you think D.B. Cooper really was? A professional, a copycat, or just a desperate man who got lucky? Let me know your theory in the comments. And if you, like us, believe that every mystery has a story, subscribe to the Unsolved Chronicle for more cases that remain unsolved.